Alright guys, welcome back to PacWest Bigfoot. This is David, and everything should be working just fine here today. I wanted to say thank you guys so very much for being around here and being on here and listening to these awesome encounter stories from people. Let's see here. Any updates real quick? Yes, next week I will be introducing the new winner, announcing the new winner for the new autographed book by William Jevning, the Minnesota Iceman. And then I will get that out towards the end of the week to the winner. Real quick, hold on one second. We are early in the morning here. A sip of that Sasquatch coffee. Yeah. Some of you guys have been asking me a little bit about Gunner and Sasquatch coffee and everything else. He's actually a big-time researcher, and he does a lot of really cool interviews with people like, Cliff Barrickman and from Finding Bigfoot and a lot of other guys. Just to let you know, I will be doing an interview and a sit-down with Gunner here in the next week or two, talking a little bit about Sasquatch here in Oregon. And it's going to be pretty cool. He is also he is the creator of Monster X Radio and also the owner of Sasquatch Coffee. So there we are. Clear my throat. It is morning time, and I want to say good Friday to you guys. Good Friday, and I know that this is Easter weekend. I want to say happy Easter to you guys. I'm a believer myself, and just want to say God bless you guys, and thank you for being here. Don't forget, I do run on donations here, and basically just the basic AdSense stuff. So to pay for all this and keep this stuff going and to feed my kids, if you don't mind donating, you can get over to PacWestBigfoot.com and donate a little something if you want. If you don't, that's okay. That's okay. No worries. Anything else? No, if you guys want to get in there and you want to win some free cool Bigfoot stuff, and I've got some really cool stuff coming up for May and June. It's going to be awesome. Get over to PacWestBigfoot.com and go ahead and join the clan. So with that, let's get to this week's encounter story. And this one came to me. Came to me secondhand by a family member of the husband and wife. So here we go. Bigfoot terrorizes man and woman in a teardrop trailer. Heart o' the Hills, year-round camping in Washington State. That is where my wife and I were staying when we had a rather frightening encounter with the creature known to many as Bigfoot or Sasquatch. While we have returned to the scene of the proverbial crime since then, it took a little convincing of my wife to do so. But because of this encounter, I wanted to see if this thing was still around, still haunting the forest nearby, if you will. And although I may be pushing our luck, I am curious to see this thing again. I don't know why, but I do. Here is our encounter. Teardrop mania in the heart of the hills. My wife and I are retirees with the state of California. Actually, we worked for the energy department for a few decades. Retirement was not going to be Mexico or Palm Springs like many retirees. For us, it was going to be traveling through the Pacific Northwest, across Canada, and then through the northern part of the good old US of A first. After that, we would decide where we would settle for the rest of our lives in the Pacific Northwest. Which, just so you know, we settled near Crescent City, California, about 2 years after this trip we took. Teardrop trailers in the early 2000s were becoming, and since have become, quite the little fad again. Traveling around, staying in campgrounds and RV parks for the short term was something we wanted to do. Actually, we opted for a 3-month tour of the Northern Hemisphere, basically one big circle. We would start in California, go up and through the Pacific Northwest into British Columbia, and then straight through to the east coast of Canada, then across the U.S. on highways 90 and 94. This was our first road trip this long. It was the retirement gift we always wanted to give each other. So in the fall of 2009, we took off in our Dodge pickup truck, hauling our new little teardrop. Coffee. Yeah. We would take Highway 101 all the way north, with our first stops being that of Santa Cruz area, and then, of course, a place we would come to love, Crescent City. After a few stops in Oregon for a few nights or so, we finally made it to a campground outside of a place my wife wanted to visit because of the movie about vampires, Twilight. We decided we had time to stay about 3-4 nights there and visit Port Angeles and roam around the Olympic National Forest and the nearby beaches too. I do remember her mentioning that the forest here was rather ominous, being so dark and wet and all. Something she literally said, jokingly of course, that Bigfoot probably lived here. It was amazing, though, since we hit the redwoods and all the way up through Oregon to where we were at that point, the forests of the Pacific Northwest really can be foreboding if you are not used to it. Beautiful, yeah, but still foreboding. We were on a trip in the off-season, and although we knew we would run into some bad weather here and there, we were prepared for it. Well, we hoped we were at least. Besides, we were in no hurry to get anywhere, so whether it be snow or rain, we would wait it out. Besides, we were planning on beating the worst of it heading out in early September. So the crowds were mostly gone, and the camping area was all but empty around the heart of the hills, and we opted for the furthest site away from the entrance of the campground, just in case. Hey, we wanted nature as much of it as we could get, and I'll tell you what, we got it, and a huge part of it. Who been eating my porridge? It was not even by the end of the first day that we had our first incident with the wildlife out and up here. We set up our camp and decided to hit Port Angeles for lunch. It was still warm out, and the day was surprisingly sunny for this neck of the woods. At least that is what we heard from the locals. My wife left out a few things on the picnic table by chance back at camp. Just a few things, a box of cereal and a 6-pack of sodas. That'll be irrelevant in just a moment. We ate, walked around town and the waterfront for a bit, and headed back to camp. Pulling in, we noticed that the soda pop had moved and the cereal box was opened and spread all over the place. We chalked it up to crows or some other animal or bird and cleaned up the mess. What I did not notice, for a little while at least, was that there was evidence of what visited our camp while we were gone. It was nearly dinner time when I noticed them, but I saw what were impressions in the ground. Well, one impression by the table and a couple more near the edge of the campsite. They looked to be in the shape of a foot, a human foot, only larger and, well, I guess blockier, if you can picture that in your mind. Now, I have to say, while this thing terrorized us at first, we thought it was just another animal, too afraid to come close, but wild enough to have fun with us, if you will. I showed my wife, but she could not really see or make out what I was seeing. Maybe I was making out something that was not there, but I swear I could see the impressions. Or, possibly, it was just getting too dark. We sat down for dinner, around the fire. It was almost dark, completely, and there was nobody around. I even think the campsite service person left for the night. My wife got up suddenly and was leaning forward looking into the trees. I asked her what she was looking at, and all she did was point. About 30 or so yards into the trees near a trail we walked up a bit earlier, there seemed to be a large shadow or silhouette of something tall standing, and it looked to be swaying in and out from behind a tree. I told her it was probably just another tree, but she argued the point, saying it looked more like a person. I decided to try to move a bit closer, but like the footprint impressions earlier for her, I just could not see what she was seeing at that moment, this time. It made her feel a little creeped out, scared even, so we opted for the Teardrop and the satellite television or DVD after cleaning up. Snoop and poop. We were in the middle of the classic Field of Dreams, I remember, when I heard something enter our campsite. They were heavy footsteps, and they were approaching the trailer rather quickly. I turned down the television set, and we both looked at each other with a look of confusion and with a bit of fear, I believed at the time. Who was walking through, or better yet, into our campsite? I motioned to my wife, and she reached over into a small cupboard and pulled out a small caliber handgun we kept in there for safety. Of course, it was empty at the time. I had not gotten around to loading it at that point, but you can bet I did in a few seconds. Anyways, the next thing we heard was a tapping-like sound on the top of the teardrop. It sounded like a finger tapping on a table, only the sound of the trailer made it a hollower sounding and louder. Tap, tap, tap. 4 taps. I remember it making 3 or 4 different times. My wife reached over, turned off the television, and that is when the tapping stopped and the frightening part of that evening started. The teardrops are falling. It felt like it was pushed. Not too hard, but something pushed on the teardrop, just hard enough to have it move side to side for a moment. Okay, we were pushed. And then seconds later, something smacked the side of the trailer. Not too hard again, but enough to know there was something or someone outside. We stood there in disbelief. What in the world was out there? A bear? A large lion? Mountain lion? A crazy person on the loose? The latter was the scariest idea that floated through my head, a person. But what it ended up being was, well, even more frightening. It sounded like a hand as a second smack or slap hit the opposite side of the trailer next. My wife pulled the covers up around her shoulders, I remember, in an almost typical movie-esque fashion. Personally, I felt like doing it too, as if the blanket seemed like it was a shield that could protect us from the wilds that were at the moment outside our door, literally. Another push, but this time the unimaginable. I could see the wall being pushed in. I thought it would end up pushing right through the thin wall of the teardrop, but it, whatever it was, gave a push off and the trailer rocked again. We still sat there, paralyzed. My wife, after a moment or two, asked me to listen closely near the door. I could hear it. There was something rummaging through the campsite now. I could not sit there anymore. I decided to make some noise as if I was just waking up or something, pretending not to be scared or in shock as we were at the moment. I started to move around and said something to my wife rather loudly. Started shaking the door handle all the while. I held tightly to the gun. The sounds of rummaging stopped and something made the sound of walking off. Literally walking off on 2 legs. That freaked me out. And although I was still frightened, I figured it had to be a person, and I had a gun, so most likely I had the upper hand. I jumped out of the trailer, and nothing. Nobody was there. Just a few things that were on the table were strewn about, on the ground, and on the ground again. It stood there. I stood there looking around, but even at that point the fire was still bright enough to light up the campsite itself, but beyond that, well, I then asked my wife to toss me the flashlight. I turned it on and started looking around briefly. At that moment, I decided it would be smarter to look for some sign or tracks on the ground. I could make out prints almost immediately around the table and over around the trailer. They were footprints. They looked human in shape and form. I could even make out toes with a few of them. I started following them around the camp, all the time talking to my wife, who was still wrapped up in a blanket, but had moved to the doorway of the teardrop. I kept following the footprints around, and I have to say they were huge. I put my own foot in one, gauging what I could see through the beam of flashlight. They were at least 16 to 17 inches long and a couple or more inches wider than mine. And yes, at that point, I had boots on. I followed the tracks around the trailer, back to the table. And then I noticed that the last 2 or 3 I could make out headed off towards the backside of the campgrounds, basically off into the forest. I shined my light up into the pitch black of the tree line, and that is when I noticed movement. It stood there, staring at us, swaying slowly back and forth near a large tree it was touching with its left hand. The spread of the chest on this thing was huge, and it had to be at least 3.5 feet wide, and I think it was a female. His huge breasts seemed to take up the rest of the chest area. I could not help but keep the light on her, and as I did, I saw what looked like a really messed up face of a gorilla, only the nose was more human, but flatter. She stood there, head still, but the body swaying still back and forth. I motioned for my wife, but she would not budge. She said she could see it from where she was in the light. Then she told me to get in the car, and she would follow. I took her advice and slowly backed away from what I could see was a female Bigfoot. She was at least 7 to 8 feet tall, dark-colored hair from what I could tell as I kept backing up to the truck. I did not want to make any fast movements just in case this thing would react to them. We slipped into the vehicle, shut the doors, and drove to Port Angeles. Back to the scene of the crime. We watched as the sun came up over the water and into the little bakery we would grab some breakfast at. After getting a donut apiece, we got back in the truck and drove back to the campground. And yes, my wife was rather reluctant at first, but we needed to retrieve our trailer and things. I wanted to get some pictures with with the camera of what footprints I could still see and make out. There were at least 2 I noticed around the trailer that would be great proof, but my wife would have none of it. She wanted to hook up and leave immediately. So I pulled the dent out of the top of the trailer, and it looked almost brand new again. And so we did. We packed up fast and left. During that trip, we never had any other experiences, and it took a couple weeks or so for my wife to not feel so spooked out about staying in wooded areas. So suffice it to say, we stayed near towns for a little while. Today we live near the woods, and my wife is not so scared as much as she is curious, like I, what we saw that night in the Olympic National Forest. As a matter of fact, we both are, and have been back there to look around for it. We do get out in the redwoods from time to time as well, but we are not regulars as far as Bigfooting is concerned. We are just day trippers with the whole researching thing. Which means, when we are picnicking in the woods, we look for sign of this awesome creature. And that, well, that is about as far as it goes. Thank you.